Hey everybody, and welcome to part two of the Painter Motivating Painters review for April. Uh, so we're gonna just pick off exactly where we left off. So we've got our first piece today is Mike Geppert, or whatever way you say that. Decided to give Stormcast a try. Love the angel models, especially this big Celestin Prime dude. I think that's what he's called. And Alex, you are first up.
Yeah, so overall, you sort of haven't asked for anything in particular. So just going to go with sort of general things. So overall, I think the first thing that stands out to me is you've got the focus quite nice. When a model with sort of this many big things that are sort of flying out all over the place, the big swirlies at the bottom and the massive wings, it can be quite difficult to keep the focus in the right places. But it does sort of generally draw into the face, which is nice. The way you've got sort of the really bright gold there, sort of compositionally that works really well. So I really, really like that. I think the red is generally quite nice and bright, and it's quite a tricky color to work with. For getting nice coverage and keeping things sort of smooth. So you've done really, really well there. Just on things to maybe sort of uptick for next time. Pushing contrast could be a little bit more. On the more zoomed out photos, it can be a little bit hard to differentiate sort of between sort of different details. Um, so just sort of even if it's not necessarily going in with lots of layering and things, if you're sort of quite happy to keep within sort of the realms of one or two highlights in that sort of Games Workshop style rather than going into those extreme contrast styles. Just sort of some really strong edge highlights and recess shades just to really break up the shapes. Particularly that nice sort of liney shape on the chest pleats. When it's zoomed in, where you can see where you've got that sort of, it looks like you've applied a wash over it, where you can see that when it's sort of zoomed in on the photos, it picks up really nicely. But once it's a bit more zoomed out, or that sort of across the table sort of view in a game, the details kind of blur into one. It's just some stronger edge highlights, with gold, edge highlighting with silvers usually works quite well to make those sort of really sharp details pop out and sort of sparkle. Besides that, I think again going into washes, it looks like you've used a wash against sort of the red cloak on the back, and it's not necessarily the best technique to use. Washes like to settle into sort of really deep crevices and recesses. Cloaks and very flowing sort of smooth volumes like that don't really have those. So it looks like you've got a little bit of coffee staining just sort of on the back camera right side. In particular, is an area where I can sort of see that a bit more clearly. So just something maybe like a layering technique or sort of a gentle dry brush would sort of be a little bit more suited to that material, but that's something that you pick up with sort of that bit more experience in sort of painting those volumes and figuring out what techniques work best where. But overall, I think it's quite a nice piece.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add there. I agree mostly with what you said about the contrast, but in particular, I thought that, as you said, the attention's drawn quite nicely inward, the way the color transitions and the brightness kind of increases towards the middle. But the white armor, I think, is letting it down the most. I think if you were to increase some shadows and pop some more highlights on the white armor, that would really just bring it together that little bit further. But and it's a really interesting kind of shimmery effect paint they've used with these blues and purples that are in the wings and this like fiery baton thing. I think it's really cool. So yeah, that was my two P's. Matt, you got
Yeah, I
anything?
think the wings are really strong. The way, like, I've never seen anyone do this thing where it's like gold and then it fades this kind of like more irony looking material there on the edges. And that's one of the things that's really helping focus it because it's basically a circle around the model. So you could further that if you wanted to do like he's got this halo, and you could have like an irony, like have the same kind of weathering or whatever happening on that. Then you'd have two concentric circles that would draw the focus even more in towards the face. And you could even have a little bit on the bottom of his gorget or whatever. But yeah, it's a really good looking piece. And like Alex said, it's like a super busy model, and you've done a really good job of making everything read well in it. So,
Cool. So there you go, Mike. Cheers. next up, then we got Joe. You taking this one, Matt? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So Joe, again, not looking for anything in particular. Submitted this bony samurai dude. It's really cool. Um, so I think I really like how you've done the dark colors on this, like the black. You know, it reads quite well, and it's very kind of brooding and menacing. Uh, it's very like I like you. There's a lot of little details like ropes that are in between everything. That's quite well picked out, and that can be tricky and time consuming and everything like that. So appreciate it that you put that effort in there. I challenge you. Like my challenge for you would be just think about why you've picked the colors you've got on him because it's a primarily black model, but you've got yellow, green, turquoise, purple, blue, and red. So basically every color apart from orange. And colors tell a different story. Like, black and red would be a typically very like kind of a violent combination of colors. You could add the gold there, it gives the impression of kind of nobility and this kind of thing. The skin you can kind of get away with because it's his skin tone. But just like I really like the blue green you have on his shin pads, but then I'm like, why is the blue green there, but then all the ropes on the armor are red? Um, and then the earrings are this very very saturated green, which isn't necessarily like I'm not sure. Maybe that's like some sort of heraldry based thing, but I just sort of think it feels a little bit like you picked each element. You're like all the ropes have to be red, and they are, but they don't. They can be whatever color you want them to be. So just have a think about when you're working your model, like why be intentional about how you put the colors on there. Because if you made this guy have like a glowing red gem and then he was primarily red, then he'd basically be samurai only Darth Vader, and that's like a particular image. But when you have, a blue green, that's kind of very natural colors, and it's conflicting with maybe some of the other ideas that we have here in it. But everything on it is painted very well. So look forward to seeing more from you in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree that it's kind of overwhelmingly dark for the majority of the piece, but then the riot of colours around it they're not really resolving and they're not working together as well as they maybe could if they were selected a little bit more carefully, as you say. So it kind of appears a little bit random where the colours are, other than all the ropes being red. But a good way to think about it is try to make shapes on the model. So squares is a good way of doing it. So you'd have four things the same colour, and they'll be around an area you're trying to draw attention to. Or a triangle or a circle or straight lines where you're trying to draw the eye to the main focus of the piece. So you're kind of getting away with it here because the headpiece is gold, and so that's drawing quite a bit of attention. But the most attention grabbing thing I'd say is the blue gem, and that's probably not a great result, just because it's that bright. It's the brightest thing on the mini, and the brightest thing on them really wants to be up near his face, unless you're painting in a very deliberate and aggressive lighting. But that doesn't appear to be what you're going for here. So yeah, just a little bit more careful with color selection next time, and drawing the attention up to the face, because it's a nice big and detailed face, and that for me it should be the main focus of it. Okay, cool. Alex, you got anything?
No, not that's not really been covered really. Quite comprehensive between the two of you.
Okay, cool. Moving on then. We've got Hampus Broman with a little skink dude, and apparently he's a fan of Pokemon. So again, no specific feedback. So I'll start by saying that I think the skin's a pretty good success. There's a nice range of colours in there. Nice use of shadows. You could maybe deepen some of the shadows under the arm a little more, but you've obviously done a very good job of it on the tail here, and under this arm here, and under his neck, and this shin here. So you're placing your shadows very nicely, and I think the highlights go up far enough, and it's giving the skin that kind of sheeny effect without it looking like dead shiny. So they're good transitions, and you've gone the full range. But again, a lot of people go too deep with their shadows between muscles, so you've avoided that nicely here. So the skin's a great success, I'd say, and so is this eye. I mean, I'm going to zoom in and show it off for everybody, but that's a banging little eye on a skink. Well done. Amazing, with a little glint in there as well. So Super sweet. But while we're zoomed in this far, it's just a little couple of areas of cleanliness. Like up here, you've got some green on the gold. Over here, it looks like there's some green on the black. So just being really, really nitpicky. Obviously, if this was tabletop standard, then whatever. But say what you see. And then the only other thing, really, besides cleanliness, was you could maybe punch this blue a little more. It looks a little bit desaturated, so making that blue a little bit bolder and brighter, I think would have been a nice touch. And then the last thing I noticed with it really is the gold seems a little bit like one or two passes at it. So I think if you were to add some more reflections in it, deepen the shadows and put some edge highlights, I think this is the metallic paint doing the work for you. So as Alex said previously, silver highlights for gold works really, really well. So yeah, just an opportunity there to push that a little bit further. Don't know what's going on in the back because we've only got the one picture, right? Unless there was any in the comments, which there wasn't. So yeah, on the whole, yeah, really nice and smooth. Great color scheme, green and purple, really nice. So yeah, nice job, Hampers.
Yeah, just to add on there, something that I think works really, really well here, like you just mentioned at the end there on the color scheme, is just how it's going from the previous one to this one, and it's sort of, this is a really good example of what we were saying before of keeping the colors sort of really intentionally chosen and sort of well spaced out. You've got the purple at the top and then at the bottom, sort of balances out really well. The sort of the way that the skin's a relatively desaturated color, and then the feathers, I think their feathers are a little bit sort of a little bit more saturated. It just sort of brings that attention in, particularly with the really, really saturated eye color there. It's really, really sort of smartly chosen, and just I think it's compositionally it's really, really sort of nice. And then the one thing that sort of stood out to me, and again it's being nitpicky because when something's painted quite cleanly and quite sort of well in this style, you need to be. It's just the base for me feels a little bit like less effort was spent there. I think with these sort of sculpted GW bases, it can be quite easy to just sort of paint it and call it done. I've never been too fond of the sculpted bases. I'll always sort of take them off and not actually use them, just because I think that they're not overly exciting. So I'd always say if you're going to work with the base, treat it as more of a starting point, and you've got some tufts or some pigment powders and things just to boost it up, because in the nicest way to the GW sculptors, I think they're fantastic artists, but when it comes to sculpting sculpted bases, they always look a little bit like sculpted bases. So they just need that little bit of boost of some extra foliage and things just to push them up and make it a fitting base for such a nicely painted model.
Yeah, I really love the feathers, the way it's got there's a lot of colors in there. It's like orange, purpley, red, mauve, but they're all kind of desaturated enough and really cleanly applied that it doesn't attract too much attention, but when you look, there's a bit of interest there for you. Um, on composition, one thing you could do is he's got that gem in his weapon, and it's this kind of bluish color. It's similar to the necklace. I probably would have made the button on the Pokeball the same, and then you'd have symmetry there, where you'd have that color is on both sides of it, and then the eyes in the middle.
Good shout.
Again, it's only a small thing, but there's no real reason not to do that if you get me. And it'd break up a bit of the gold as well. Like the gold is a very nicely applied gold, but it could do with having a bit more interest to it. But it's a good model.
Sweet. Thanks for submitting, Hampers. All right, moving up, we've got Alex taking on. Oh, I've got some pictures in the comments there as well. Okay, so John Israel then, Alex.
Yeah. So just saying here about there was a piece for competition, sort of taking silver, capital, sort of take it on something like Capital Palette. I'm not entirely sure of what their sort of judging rubric is. It's I think it's Nova Open's competition. As you can tell from the accents, all three of us are not American, so don't really know much about what the specifics of that competition are, and that's always something to sort of consider, is the competition specifically. Everyone has a slightly different rubric and slightly different things they're looking for. But just in general, and since you've asked for competition, sort of feedback being a little bit more nitpicky than possibly usually, just to sort of fit with that question, really. Just looking here, I think overall it's quite nice. I think the scheme is pretty cohesive. Sort of gone with that secondary color, sort of orange and greens. Um, I think that the green is maybe a little bit off-putting in that on the sword. You've got it sort of dotted about other places, but it's pretty much only on the sword in terms of where your eye gets immediately drawn to. So I think the actual balancing of the colors could be a little bit more sort of evenly done. Maybe these sort of areas around sort of the upper half around the face where you've got sort of blacks and things could be a similar green, or maybe a desaturated toned down version of that green, maybe using the green to highlight the black instead of just going through grays, just to kind of balance it out a little bit more. I think that the orange is done quite nicely. You've got a really nice sort of transition. It has that kind of slightly more early sort of 2000s to mid sort of 2000s style about it. A bit like a lot of the, I can't remember what game it was, but there was one with these sorts of mechs that came out around that time that had this really sort of almost panel modulation sort of look to it that I think is really nice. I think the contrast works well. For me, something that stands out is just the way you've done the power sword. You've got very even jumps between these sort of breaks, and it just doesn't quite feel um, natural. It feels like you're trying to. You've got it. You've understood that with these sorts of weapons, you need these gradients that jump back and forth between light and dark and light and dark. So it feels a bit like you're following that script of going light to dark to light to dark to light to dark, rather than sort of spacing them out, having them be a little bit more natural, a little bit more uneven, and having that sort of bright white and then into the midtones. It feels like a lot of the time you're going from your 1 to your 5. So it just doesn't quite read how I think you're intending it to read. Um, so you could sort of play a little bit of that to push that forward. And then the bass, I think, is really nice. Um, I think it tells a bit of a story there, which is really important. Um, could be a little bit dirtier, which sounds a bit of an odd thing to say, but it looks like it's a bit of an abandoned city type scape. So pigment powders and things to really sort of sell that, some dirt on the feet and things would help with that as well. But overall, I think it's quite a nice piece. Just sort of pushing things a little bit further, just in terms of um, the making things look a little bit more natural, and making things look a little bit more cohesive, is really where you're looking at sort of taking the next step. Just a little bit more um, intentional uh, attention to sort of the composition of it. But overall, it's quite nice.
Matt, you got anything to add?
Yeah, obviously that will be a little bit harder on you on account if you do this for a competition piece. I think technically, like the armor, as Alex said, is very very well painted. I like the way it's got that nice transition and there's bits of nicks and stuff in it. The gun in the top view technically isn't as well painted. It's got like very quite obvious edge highlighting on it, and then there's no. It's just flat black otherwise, which isn't. You've got a lot of panel modulating on other elements here, so you probably want that to follow through onto the gun. Um, and then I just looked quickly at like capital palette winners, and they seem a lot of like individuality in those pieces. And for any competition, that's a good idea as well to make the model your own in some way. So like you could add freehand onto like give like a unit number or like an LF symbol or whatever, um, just to show A, that you can do that, and B, that it is a unique sort of your own take on the model. And then for the sword, I would probably it's a very annoying shape.
Mm.
So you would have been probably what you could do is replace the blade entirely with just another sword blade, or fill in all these awkward like holes that it has in it and that weird notch down the bottom, because you don't have much space to play with for your light reflections, and it's a very weird looking shape anyway. So you kind of is making things more difficult for you. So if you had cut that, obviously it's far too late for us now. But if you were looking at like planning your project out, you'd be like, cut that off to begin with, get a different looking sword that's going to be more unique, and also make your life easier when it comes to doing your NMM slash power weapony type of effect. But it's super well painted on the armor and all the other parts, and on the base. Like I really love it.
Cool. There you go, John. Moving up to Costas, Matt, isn't it now?
Yep. So this is my second time reviewing this exact model this month, and a very different take on it, and a very good take as well. So on the chameleonic effect, I think like its arms and legs look really good. I don't think if you hadn't told me that it was blending in with the pillar, I wouldn't have known. I would have just thought it's got these wolfy legs that fade to this grayish color that's like just looks really good and kind of natural. Um, if you want to kind of show that it uh is like adjusting its color to match its surroundings, you probably want to go with the actual color of the environment being more different from its skin tone because like they're both quite desaturated. Like if this was a yellow, like a sandstone pillar, and its feet were becoming super light, it would sell more, but it would probably not look as good. So I don't know. That's neither here nor there really. It looks well. Um, on the NMM, that sword blade in the front view is like incredibly realistic looking. It's like really good. How you've got that light in the middle and you've got rust running up to it and everything. Like just that whole section of it like looks like NMM often is quite exaggerated and not that realistic, whereas this looks like yeah that could be an actual sword for this section here in particular, where you have the main light on it. What you could probably do is add a highlight onto the pommel there, which wouldn't really, it's kind of faking it because probably it's going to be in shadow a bit. But this is an important line on the figure. Like he's got this sword that guides your eye into the middle of him, and then it's opposed by his arm, like he's kind of T posing but at an angle. But you got this really bright light then on the sword, and it's not connecting back to the light in the armor, so it kind of draws your eye down. Whereas if you had a light on the pommel, it would probably bring it up more, which is pretty minor. But again, it's like the sculptor kind of thought of that. That's a leading line there, so followed through with it, even if it's not necessarily the most realistic thing. You know, what looks better looks better. Um, and then yeah, all the blood effects look great. The armor's kind of suitably weathered and nasty looking, and the extra kind of weathering bits on the paintwork on the base work really well. So another really great take on this model. And the pictures I think are fine. Like we've definitely had worse pictures. I've taken worse pictures of my model, so don't worry too much about it. We can all tell what's going on at least.
And congratulations on the competition win, man. That's great.
Totally.
I thought the same thing about just differentiating the color of the stone pillar and the skin a bit, but I probably would have pushed the skin to a different color. Any color, your vampire, whatever. But I think if you'd have made the pillar brighter, it would have drawn the attention away. If that makes sense. So yeah, but exactly the same thought. But I just would have gone the other way and made the skin a different color, and maybe punch up the highlights on the face just a little bit because there's a lot of highlights happening on the armor, and as Matt rightly said, you want that line of highlights drawn up there, but then it's going to be if that pommel was connecting it up there, I think just a little bit more on the face would be helpful as well. But yeah, otherwise, great stuff, Costas. Alex, you got anything?
Yeah, just on the sort of my one sort of thought, besides what sort of you've already all mentioned, is just the hair and the fur feels a little bit dry, if that makes sense. In that it's lacking those sort of really bright highlights. Again, I think this might just be down to you've held back on sort of the skin and the hair and things where you might expect things to be a bit brighter to help the NMM sell. That's something that I think is commonly told piece of advice is save pure whites just for your NMM. But we still need those sorts of near whites on the hair and on the face just to help push that contrast and really sell what they are. Your fur, you've kind of highlighted every individual clump, rather than sort of highlighting it as one volume and then picking out all of the strands. I know these sorts of sculpted, particularly GW sculpted fur patches can be quite difficult to paint because of that, because they give such big bumps. I think fur texture should be, to be honest, mostly smooth, so that you can sort of paint your own texture in there. You know, that's a personal opinion is on this kind of sculpted fur. I don't think looks very realistic, and it's really hard to paint and make it look, you know, really, really convincing. So it's not a big thing to sort of have as a sort of something that stands out to me as not being quite as nicely painted as everything else. But just something to be aware of as painting it as one big volume rather than all the little volumes individually.
Cool. Yeah, good point. I hate sculpted fur as well. It never looks great. All right, moving on then. Bilkins again. Nice to see you back. Here's another model for Warhammer Underworlds, the Vampire Lady. Just going through feedback about light placement and textures, as well as general thoughts and missed opportunities. Went with TMM because gaming. Yeah, I thought this looks really good, man. There's really nice work here on the textures and on the overall contrast on it. So well done there. Good work on the hair. It's better at the front from this angle, where you've got like the sheen effect on it. It's best up here. This bit's okay, but I think you could push this a little bit further. And then as we get down these side bits here, you're sort of losing that sheen effect. I get that you're probably trying to keep the highlights brighter up near the face, but the face is more than bright enough anyway, I think. So you could certainly get away with having more highlights in the hair. Just those, you know, those top white sheen highlights. You can see it on the back here as well. There's a little bit going on, but I think pushing that a little bit further would be helpful. Texturing, while we're at this picture, really nice texturing. I just think that it could be a little bit tighter together, sort of, you know, you've got these little gaps in here. It's pretty picky, but if this was a little bit more consistent with the scratching and hashing, I think it would sell a little bit better here as well. See, it's just a little bit sparse. There are some areas where it works well on this arm. I think that works quite well. And then having a very light glaze of your mid-tone just to bring it all together would be nice. The red arm I thought looked quite cool, but I'm not sure what material you're going for, whether it's supposed to be metal, because it's obviously red and it's, you know, it's shaded and highlighted, but I don't really get why it's got these kind of ivory or goldish highlights. It's kind of confusing a little bit, and if this is damage, it's not really resolving very well as damage because it's just light lines in there. But again, I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be sort of a steel or some of it is leather, because it could be either as far as I'm seeing. So if it is metal and it is damaged and scratched and dented, it could do with black lines above, or black marks above all of the light ones. So the light ones look like light catches. So yeah, that's my thought on the armor. And then for the swords, I just think you need to push the hue contrast a little bit further. They do look a little bit monotone, so it looks like they've got edge highlights and a nice sharpening highlight at the bottom. But I think if you had some more shadows in it and then some really broad highlights across the swords as well, this one looks pretty good up here. But this one, as you can see, is they're just poles apart, these two. Yeah, that's my feedback, Bilkins. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just gonna sort of agree with you on the armor. That was the main thing that stood out to me. Is I'm not entirely sure what it's meant to be material wise, in terms of sort of on the zoomed out photos. When I'm sort of before I click onto the post, it very much looks like leather. Then you sort of click into it, and it looks almost like it might be like a burnt bone or a maybe a red black metal. But it just doesn't quite read as anything specific. I'd love to know what it is you're aiming for, because it could be that it's one of those things where as soon as you say it, we're like, yes, that's exactly what it is. In which case, you know, it's could be a very well done achieving of something that just none of us quite think of regularly. So just it isn't in the front of our mind to think, oh, that's obvious sort of thing. But it could also be just the case that it's just not quite selling in the way you're hoping to. And if we know what it is, we could give a bit more sort of feedback on how to make it look more like that thing. The only other thing that sort of stands out to me is, again, I think that the hair is really nice as well. Like I've already said, it has that sheen that a lot of people's hair when they paint them does lack. So I think it's one of the sort of a really nice attempt or success at painting hair. And on the textures, I think everything feels a little bit samey with the textures. It's all sort of quite sporadic and quite sort of hash marks. Mixing in maybe stippling for one of the fabrics and sort of hashing and cross hatching for some of the metals and things, and just sort of just varying it up a bit. Texture is a really nice thing to add for that contrast, sort of between what's smooth and what's textured, and what the different textures are. But when everything's kind of textured the same, it doesn't have as much impact, and it doesn't really. It no longer becomes a contrast when they're all sort of similar. But no, overall, I think it's a really nicely painted piece. I think the color scheme works really well as well.
Yeah, I think good shout on the using the true metallic metals, because you've got a very convoluted kind of basket tilted swords, and you could have really wrecked your head trying to do them in NMM, and if that's not what you want to do, then do it the other way. They look well in true metallic metal as well.
Cool. All right, moving on. Moving on up. Oh my God, who's this guy again? Your turn, isn't it, Alex? To review
Yeah, that's the one.
Master O'Brien's submission this month.
You're being in the call. You're subject. You're lucky enough to be able to answer the question of how harsh you want us to be.
Whatever you want. My lips are zipped.
I think it's it's a really nice color scheme. It's the first thing that stands out to me is it's really sort of in that slightly sort of desaturated, slightly analogous scheme. It works really nicely. Um, it feels cohesive. It feels like it's not a chore to look at like some color schemes can be, where you're trying to focus on something. But you keep getting dotted about, or it feels like you're just being hit in the eyes by color. So that's always a plus in my books. In terms of the focus, it is quite an odd model to paint in terms of keeping a focal point. A lot of the time we'll talk about needing a face there to sort of, the human brain naturally looks at faces, but you don't really have one here. So trying to pick out that sort of focal area, you're right that it is going to be tricky here. I think you've done quite a good job at keeping it up towards where the face would be, with those sort of gold bits sort of framing the faceless head. It does pull that up. It's a little bit pulled down towards sort of the lower abdomen, just because I think it's quite a bright value there with the skin. I think to an extent that's kind of unavoidable when you don't have face there. There's definitely going to be ways around that, sort of maybe going really, really sort of bright on the fabric on his sort of like hood. Would maybe have done that, but you've already got quite a bright sort of highlight line running down that seam in the fabric there. And sort of trying to get that slightly shiny look to the fabric, you need that sort of short transition straight up to the bright colors, so you can't really play with that too much by trying to lean into that texture. So maybe instead of going for a shiny texture, aiming for more of a sort of satiny velvety look, so you can spread out the highlights a bit, keep those volumes a bit more widely defined, might help, just because it would sort of allow you to play a little bit more of the contrast up there. Something else that stands out quite nicely to me is, I think the freehand on the back is really nice. It's really clean. It's really sort of it sells as paint as a sort of woven in sort of design, rather than something that you can tell has been painted on the top, which is always nice. I think sort of the pseudo non-metallic highlighting on it to sort of give it that sort of almost like a gold thread type effect works really well. I know those sorts of shapes can be a bit weird to make look like a shape whilst also looking sort of with that metallic look, so that's a success. Something that feels like it could have used a bit more attention is the base. I think you've got lots of nice foliagey things, but something that always it's a personal nitpick, that it might be something that other people disagree with, but for me, having when you add foliage and stuff, it needs to be primed down and then painted up. Having sort of raw twigs and stuff, so to speak, and roots and things, where it's just been stuck on to look like that, doesn't really work as an effect for me. Maybe you painted it too well. It looks like it is what it is, but it just feels a little bit out of scale to me. But besides that, I think it's quite a nice piece. I think you've done well with a weird sort of model, so that's something to be sort of happy with. Anything from you, Jim?
Yeah, agree mostly. Although I would have probably gone for a little bit of that beautiful gold brocade on the cowl, on the headpiece, just to put a bit of focus there, because obviously the face is missing. So perhaps a missed opportunity there, just some little emblem or rune or something. Because as you say, the attention's drawn nicely there in a way. Aside from what Alex said, I really like the fish. The way you've highlighted that fish that's up there, that's cool. So nice work on that. And I thought the wood could maybe use just a little bit more love, a little bit more texture in it. I presume it's wood, right? It looks like a gnarled wood sculpted staff thing. But yeah, just a little more variation in the wood, as you've got in the metals and the cloth and the skin. Oh yeah, and question for the skin. It looks like it's kind of slick, like oily, moist. Was that what you were going for?
Yeah, kind of.
Because it looks like it's like gross. You know when you see like the Alien movies and they're all slick and slimy, and I think if that's what you're going for, I think you totally nailed it on the skin, man. That's exactly how it looks to me. But yeah, great stuff, man. I really like it, and I think the base actually is working quite well in terms of scale. I think you've picked them out. Painting them, you can do. Obviously, it's a personal preference, but I actually think this looks pretty decent, man. It didn't stand out to me as like, oh my god, those are not painted. That didn't leap out at me. It does sometimes, but I think you've done this quite nicely here. And these are your famous snow effects, yes, on the floor.
Yes.
Much better than mine. But yeah, nice work, dude.
Thanks a million.
Alrighty. So you're up next, aren't you, Matt?
Yeah. So
Bartos.
Bartos appreciate some feedback on this Rothcorn from Warhammer Underworlds, particularly the distressed leather and the indigo flesh. So I think the flesh is like really good. It's definitely one of the standout bits of the model for me. I love how you've saved the most contrast for the face, and that's something that a lot of time you kind of go, you need more contrast. But if everything has more contrast, then you've lost some contrast there. So the face has both the darkest shadows and the lightest highlights of the skin, and that works really well because it means we're looking at the face rather than the hand or the arm or whatever. And you got a nice, I like the kind of the color transition from the indigo into kind of a more violety, whitey thing, and you got little cuts in it as well. So it's top marks for the skin for me. On the distressed leather, I think it's definitely looking like very well weathered. Um, doesn't immediately like the cloak in the back in particular. Uh, it could be some kind of sackcloth material either, but I think that's a lot to do with our expectations. When you look at that, you expect it to be, because it's flowing and it's kind of folded up like that, you expect it to be fabric more so than leather. But on the front where it's kind of like across his chest and you've got the bolts in it and stuff, it's definitely reading as some kind of leather there. Um, so yeah, sometimes it's can be to do with the sculpt as well, and that what we expect to see. Oh, and his hat, it like obviously it's like a leather cap, and you've got the wear around the edge, and that looks very very well. So maybe the cloak isn't even meant to be the leather, but yeah, it looks really good on the top, and I like how it has a kind of a coherent pattern of wear, where it's like obviously on your hat, the parts that are near your face are gonna get the edges are gonna get frayed the most, and it's the most weathered and distressed, and it's got that effect as well, where the color is kind of bleached out of it as it got all cracked up. So I think that's really good, and the rusty stuff on the trap on his crossbow is really good as well. Um, One thing I think could use with a bit of punching up, if you wanted to, would be the sculpted fur again. Oh, sculpted fur, it's always an issue. On its back, where we've got kind of like, it's obviously just some sort of contrast wash or just wash going in there. I think for this kind of sculpted fur, it's often better to try and do like some kind of pattern on it. Like we had those orcs last month, wasn't that it?
Yeah.
Um, and because it just means that rather than trying to pick out every clump of hair or try to paint in a texture with hashes and lines when there's already interrupting lines, if this is some animal that has brown and white fur, and then you can kind of shade them both, and you just makes your life a lot easier rather than trying to deal with it as one color fur. And also, like this guy, if he had I'd imagine if he has a white cloak on of white sheepskin or whatever, it's not going to stay white very long anyway. So some kind, even like mud spatter or something to break up the surface probably uh, would have made it, read more naturally. But I really like this guy. He's very characterful, and I haven't seen like an ogre painted up like this before, so that was pretty cool.
Yeah, man, I agree. I'd probably just one other suggestion I'd make was the weapon is maybe a little bit overdone in terms of corrosion. So I think a nice touch would be just to stipple in some of the a couple of silver colours, so like a medium one and then like a super bright one, just so it doesn't look like the entire thing has gone completely to ruin. Because if it was this badly messed up, it's kind of not that believable that it worked terribly well. But yeah, everything else that Matt said, totally agree with, man. Great work on the leather and the skin, particularly. So yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the exact same thing there about the sort of rusting and weathering on the weapon. Just like something like that can be that rusted if it's just sort of sat somewhere and allowed to accumulate weather. But like if it's still a working in use sort of thing, like take the chains, you've got it kind of weathered all the way around and then edge highlighted with a little bit of the sort of pure color to sort of still have that glint of the metal. But where all those links are going to be rubbing against each other, that's going to be rubbing off that rust and sort of exposing raw metal.
Mm.
So just thinking about, you can weather things this heavily, and it can be a really interesting look. But thinking about any moving parts, there's not going to be any rust there where the parts are moving up against each other. In the same way you've sort of had it sort of exposed metal on the sort of tip of the spear point there and on the teeth, where they're going to be constantly cutting into things. Around the bolts where that sort of jaw thing's going to slam closed, that would have exposed metal. The chains would have exposed metal around where they're sort of linking and stuff like that. Just again, it's just that sort of keeping it just that little bit more believable that it's something that's in use. But besides that, no, everything that's already been said is pretty much covering it.
Sweet. Thanks for submitting, Bartos. Moving on. It's me now, isn't it? So, Rob Ridley, first time trying out a number of things. Airbrush glazing on the skin. Overall happy with it, but I think I might have lost a bit too much contrast. Vince always said, if you think something, you're right. So I think you might be right about that. Gone for some texture on the cloth and leather. Struggled with the straps because they're small. And needed to take to the recess and push the highlights to sell the look of the cloth. Struggled with metal as it feels flat, despite being TMM. So, okay, I'm blatantly going to have to go back to that and read it again. But I'll start with the skin. Nice tones on the skin. Having these undertones showing through. Those are really nice colours in the right place, and you haven't overdone the shadows between the muscles, which is cool. Think you maybe are right that you've lost a little bit of contrast in there. I'd say particularly in the highlights. The shadows don't look too bad for me, but taking these up to a more of a sheen, this guy would be sweating his proverbial nuts off wearing all that gear in the middle of Greece, fighting for his life. So a little bit more sheen would be a really good addition there. So metals, that to me looks like you've painted gold, but then we've got the green verdigris, which doesn't occur on gold. So either lose the verdigris if it's gold. I don't know if it would be gold actually though, because he's a gladiator in a pit. So perhaps this is more of a bronzy type of metal, in which case that would be believable. But I think it is reading a little bit like gold. So very very flat browns to get that to more towards the bronze sort of end of the spectrum would be nice. I think the texture on the cloth is pretty good. You could probably push the shadows a little bit more, and then some extreme highlights as well on the tops of the folds, because you've kind of got. So if we call this the sort of 4, and then you've got 3 and 2. So like you need more highlight going up to a 1, and then you need more shadows going up to a 5, like in this where it meets this waistband, particularly be very, very dark, and under this flap here would be dark. Same with the headpiece as well. That's kind of a little bit 4 and 3. So pushing some highlights in there would be really, really helpful. Let's pop back and see what else you said. Tried adding some texture to the cloth and the leather. Okay, so let's look at the leather. That's on the armband. Yeah, it is small, and it looks like you've applied a wash to the woolen part of it, and it's kind of pooled and stained a little bit. So as Alex said earlier, using more of a layering technique for that would probably be your friend. Let's have a look at the leather on the belt. There's not really that much there, is there? So yeah, the texturing on the leather that I can see on the straps looks pretty good. You could maybe tatter at the edges a little bit more with like an ivory or a very, very off-white. Would be a nice touch. And I think that about covers it, doesn't it? But I do think the main success here is the skin, but just push those highlights up, as I said, and then yeah, probably the next biggest thing would be to turn that metal more towards bronze, Robert. But yeah, nice and cleanly done, and yeah, look forward to seeing this guy on the base when it's done, and see how far you take it. Anyone else?
Yeah, for me, something that stood out as well is it's executed to an extent on the skin where you've got some red tones mixed in, but um, for me, everything just reads kind of as what it is, sort of thing. So the skin is skin colored, the reds are red colored, the sort of fabrics are sort of that beigey color. Just a little bit more color variation would help, just because it's such a stripped back model, not just in terms of his
Physically.
sort of lack of clothes and things, but just like it, because of that, it is very, you've got in some armor, a little bit of fabric, and a spear. There's not much going on there in terms of the sculpt, so really sort of, and you can't do much in terms of like tattooing either to sort of bring interest to that, because maybe it is a thing that happened, but I've never seen sort of gladiator sort of images before, sort of in film or in sort of any form of media, in sort of pictures either, of sort of drawings and things having tattoos. So I don't, as far as I'm aware, it may be a thing, but that's not a thing that they had. So it could easily. So you've got not much room to play with to create visual interest, just because of how little sculpted detail there is. So playing with the colors would be a really good way to sort of introduce that. Some interesting sort of red tones and maybe some blue tones in the skin in places, or some sort of purple tones and yellow tones in the worked into the reds and things like that, just to create that little bit more sort of to look at where there isn't things sculpted there to look at. But besides that, it's really nicely sort of cleanly painted, and your blends are quite nice on there. It's technically well executed. Artistically, could have a little bit more going for it, if that makes a bit more sense.
Yeah, I think it's like for a kind of historical, realistic take, it is very good. Like, people don't always necessarily look super interesting, but there are like obviously certain things you could do. Like I think if you had more weathering on his knee pads and his shield, they would read less like gold and more like bronze, and also therefore be more interesting because they'd have more to them. And I think you could have dark lining between a lot of these elements, like say on his belt where it's like cinching his skirt in, like that's gonna create a hole where light can't get in or out from it. So having a dark line, like a really strong dark line there, or like on his between his sleeve, like his glove sleeve and his skin. Again, it's going to be an occlusion shadow, and that would it adds contrast in a very subtle way, and makes it the figure just like pop a little bit more. And it is realistic that it's happened. An oil wash is like a really quick and easy way of doing that. If you want to try that out, you could also do that on the metals, and it would run in and pick out a lot of little details. You could do volumetric highlighting on the metals, but that's a lot more work as well. and because they're true metallic metal, you kind of, you know, there's other stuff going on there. Just occurred to me when Alex was talking, if you didn't want to do tattoos, but you wanted to make skin look more interesting, he could have injuries. So you could have like a big cut across here and then like blood like running in for, or like little cuts and nicks and things. Because again, anytime you can break up a large surface into smaller chunks, it creates visual interest and it makes it easier then to effectively paint the rest of the area. But it's a great looking Myrmidon or Gladiator or whatever this dude is.
Sweet. Cheers, Robert. Moving on. We got Alex is going to take our Max Pombert's Maw Crusher.
Yeah. So again, not specifically looking for any specific guided feedback, but just in general. I think it's nice and cleanly painted. I think you've got the contrast is right in place in overall. You've got a nice focus on the face, so that's a lot brighter than everything else. I quite like the purple armor. It's not something I've seen before. It definitely sort of stands out as unique, which if that's what you're going for with it, that's a really nice way to make your model stand out on the table. If you're in a gaming store or somewhere where everyone's got the same scheme, if you do something different like that, immediately everyone's going to go, oh, those look interesting. So that's always a nice thing to do. I think that your edge highlighting along it could be a little bit cleaner, a little bit tidier. Where it's on these sorts of on particularly on these models where it's not where two planes are meeting. It's sort of like a little ridge in the armor. It's a little bit harder because we always talk about and sort of explain, oh, the easy way to edge highlight is just use the side of your brush and catch on the edges. But when it's not really sharp edges, that doesn't really work. It's the same sort of concept where you're edge highlighting, the ridge down the middle of the sword. Um, it's hard to do. It requires really good sort of fine brush control. So a way to do that would be maybe thinning your paints with a bit of flow improver so it comes off the brush really, really cleanly, or just overspilling as much as you like and then using the base color of the areas around it to sort of bring that in and sort of tidy up, so to speak. Just to make those lines a little bit sharper, a little bit thinner. You say about sort of thinking maybe trying to make the rusted metal even more corroded. I don't think it necessarily needs that. You can definitely go that way. But if you are, I think what stands out to me is it feels like you've just applied metal where you think it'll look interesting and cool, which is fine. Obviously your model, if you want to paint it fully corroded and just completely rusted over, that's a scheme that could work. But with rust, something that I tend to think about it is thinking where it makes sense for there to be rust. Like on his like claw hand thing where you've got this big patch of rust in sort of the middle of the blade. Wouldn't Water wouldn't really collect there, corrosion wouldn't really happen there, particularly if it's something that he's using regularly. The places for rust to look natural are around the rivets, on faces of materials where it wouldn't get much sort of contact with other things where water can sort of sit, or in recesses, places like that, and just a little bit more variation in the color of the rust you use. Rust isn't just that bright orange sort of red oxide color. You want browns in there, some sort of more sort of darker reds, and those bright oranges, just to sort of break it up a bit and sort of make it look that little bit more natural. Whether you sort of add more or not, to me this looks like quite sort of dry, crunchy type of rust that where sort of the metal starts to sort of flake away a bit, and that's not necessarily the sort of rusting that I'd expect to see on these kinds of uh, type uses of metal, these sorts of armors and sort of weapons and things. But no, overall, I think it's quite a nice sort of unique take on these models. If anyone else has anything,
I'd agree primarily with. I think he's actually overdone the rust a little bit with the orange. You can see the ruddy reds and browns beneath it, but that really really bright aggressive orange should just be like put it on a bit of a sponge and then wipe most of it off, and then you just sort of dab it, and it's very selective in a few areas. So I actually think the rust has been overdone on this. So quick fix for that would just be to get that ruddy reddy brown colour that's underneath that orange and just do the reverse, just sponge that back over that bright orange just to knock it back a bit, because I think it's stealing a bit of too much of attention as well. It's nice up on the face, but orange and blue is a great combination, but I think there's more orange actually with all this rust than there is blue, so I think just pushing it back a little bit would help. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, cool, awesome take on these guys, man. Nice one, Matt.
Yeah, I was just gonna say pretty much that, where there's so much rust that you effectively have orange as one of your colors. So he's he's blue, purple, and orange. So that's what you want. That's cool, but like it is a lot of area of orange, and orange is quite a powerful color. And you don't want the orange isn't the main color. That's there to be your complementary color to your blue. So if you tone it down a little bit by darkening it, you'll still have your variety of oxides, and it'll still uh, look weathered without looking like it's got large kind of blobs of orangey rust in too many places. Yeah.
Cool. Nice one, Max. Thanks for submitting. Let's move on up to Matthew Corless for you, Matt.
Cool. So, Juggernaut, the goddamn Juggernaut. Is that what he says? Can't remember. It's Vinnie Jones. It's the Juggernaut in like the original X-Men film. It's very
Yeah,
well
I think
known.
it was, man. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's looking to do an NMM on this guy, and was there anything else he said? Just try some new models. Okay, cool. So just looking at the lampposty thing that he has, I think there might be a little bit of a mold line still along it, so I'd get that off if it is there. And I'm not sure how much you've done. Yeah, you kind of have it. You've done the typical kind of cylindrical highlights on them, but lampposts are galvanized, so they're not actually shiny. So like you wouldn't, unless I don't know, maybe in the States they are, but it would reflect kind of like a much more matte surface. It looks fairly matte as it is, but it wouldn't, like, if you look at a lamppost out in the street, it doesn't have lines often running straight down it like that. I think the best NMM here is on his belt buckles. They're like little disky things, and you got a nice, shape to it. But the problem is that it looks like you've kind of rotated the model as you're painting it, and then you have the highlights in different locations on each of the little discs, whereas they're all gonna, like, if you take a metal saucer and turn it upside down, the highlight stays where it is because it's in the same position relative to the light. So all those, doesn't matter what orientation the actual bit of the belt is on, all the highlights should be at 12 o'clock if that's where you're saying that your light is coming from. And that would make it, like, at the moment, like, individually they sell quite well, but seeing the highlights be in different places on them kind of betrays the illusion a little bit. And on the kind of goldy coppery metal, I think that's a pretty cool look. You've got kind of like banding patterns, and it's very comic book y, which is very appropriate for this guy. And it's much more interesting than doing it as like just flat red or whatever. But I think you could probably put the contrast a little bit higher on them. So just go up to like an ice yellow or like an off white in a few places, and you wouldn't have to be super typical with your blending. Like think about it like the way a 90s cartoon shows metal. It's often just like just put a stripe of that color there in the center of your broadest highlight, and that would make it a bit would make it read more as metal. With the helmet, you're gonna have problems because it's a dome. So probably the best way to highlight that is to do it as you have these kind of radial highlights, and then a big one, like a kind of circular one for the top, that would be similar to the things on his belt. But yeah, he's looking really good. You guys have anything to say, or will we carry on?
Alex?
No, not on. Besides what you've already said, I guess one thing that sort of slightly stood out to me was that on the sort of side-on photo, it looks like you've got a bit of sort of texture in the paint there on the helmet. So that could be a case of paint needing to be a little bit thinner, or because you've been trying to do sort of that sort of jump around the colours, where you've sort of it looks more like it's been painted where it's not fully dry yet, and you're slightly tearing those paint layers there. But besides that, that's sort of the only thing that has not already been said, sort of thing that I noticed.
Yeah, nice. I really like what you've done with the leather, how you've captured these striations in the chest muscle underneath, and all the structuring of the muscles in general that you can see on him. It's been picked out really nicely. So well done, Matthew. Nice one. Look forward to seeing that one finished. Moving up, Mark Brown with Ripley and Jonesy from, I'm presuming, Alien. Is it from Alien?
Yep. Or Aliens.
Or Aliens 2 or 3 or 17 or wherever they got to. Yeah, she looks good, man. Nice and grotty and dirty. So obviously you've gone for a particular sort of paint finish on it that seems to be a little bit glossy at the minute. Well, not really glossy, but it seems to have a bit of a sheen. Either that, or you've beautifully picked out the fact that she's been in a pretty rough time and she's sweaty as well as dirty, because it kind of looks like some of this grime down here is kind of running a little bit with these vertical lines. You see what I mean? It looks kind of like smudged and smeared, like around this knee particularly. So if that is deliberate, that is A class, man. That is really, really stunning. So beautiful work there. The cat's fur is a challenge because it doesn't look to be sculpted particularly well. So picking that out with a lot of very, very fine and individual overlapping layers of hashes in the direction of the fur, it looks like a little bit has happened. Or probably I'm not doing it justice there, but I think it could need more if you really wanted to push that fur up. Other things, I thought that the hair wasn't particularly it didn't read as a particular color very well. There's variations in it, but it doesn't sort of resolve as a particular color. You know, it doesn't look like it's black hair or an auburn hair or a brown hair. I think it just needs whatever the mid tone is. I think there needs to be a little bit more of it, just to kind of bring it all together. And the highlights to it aren't really placed in such a way that makes it really read as you know, that sheen that you get on hair. So you know, you'd expect a halo around the whole thing. So around the sort of imagine she's got a halo plonked bonk. That would be a highlight all the way around the crown of the head, and then just where some of these ringlets and curls are coming out, just a few more highlights there, just to really structure the hair around the head would be really helpful. But overall, I think she's looking really, really good, man. If there was, oops, gone too far. Gaming. Oh, how have I done that? How have I managed to go to gaming? Seriously. Sorry, I've just clicked out on the wrong thing. Let me get it back. Just a second. April. Load. Can you tell that BT are having problems in my area at the moment? Slow as hell. Yeah, so where was I? So a missed opportunity. A few wounds, bumps, scrapes, grazes, like knees, particularly elbows, knuckles. You know, she's been through hell. So I think that was a missed opportunity there. But really good work with dirtying up and texturing the fabrics to add interest there, and the shoes, obviously. So yeah, there you go, Mark. I think she's looking really nice. Just yeah, hope that feedback's helpful, man. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think the glossiness and griminess of the skin is like a really good effect. You don't see that much, but like literally, you know, I think it's a glossy finish, but it means that, you know, the lights are falling exactly where you think they would be, and you know, like the shine under her neck, like that's like what it would be like in real life.
Yeah.
I think that the definition between the fingers isn't very strong. So like, you know, where she's holding onto the cat, the kind of, you want to have a dark line. Again, they're two separate objects. You want to have a dark line between each of her fingers and the cat's fur, to make them look like they're not one single object, which is what they are in real life because it's one sculpted thingamajigger. And I think the whites of her eyes are probably a bit too white. They could be a little bit more like of an off-white or a creamy color, because the whites of your eyes aren't actually like all that white, unless you've been photoshopped. There probably would be the whitest thing on the model because of her clothing being so worn down, but there's still going to be actually, like, you know, a lot like light flesh from Vallejo, or just a very pale skin tone is often more accurate and it'll give you a little bit of that feeling of like the pinky tissue on the inside of your eye as well. Whereas if you go for straight white, it tends to look a little bit artificial because you're there. It is essentially.
All right, cool. That's one, Mark. Moving up then. This is the last one, isn't it? So, Alexis, for you, Alex. Alexis.
Yeah, so just looking at first attempts at sort of large scales and just advice on light placement, especially on metals. So overall, I think it's quite a successful sort of piece here. You know, sort of first time at larger scales. There's a lot of different considerations to have there. So I think this, works quite well. Something that I really like is sort of on the basing, how it's sort of quite nice and dusty, and you've got that dust sort of going up onto the feet and a little bit on the bottom of the fabrics there as well. I think that's a really nice touch to sort of bring it all together on that sort of weathering state. In terms of sort of the metals, I think they're applied quite nicely. It's all very cleanly painted, just generally across the whole model. I think you could probably take the highlights a bit further in terms of sort of the highlighting and shading of it. You've got a nice sort of variation of the colors in the metals, but it doesn't feel like you've forced the highlights particularly. That sort of idea of painting your true metallics with a non-metallic sort of mindset of shading down areas that you want to pull that and mute down that sort of natural highlighting from, and using sort of slightly brighter metallics where you want to sort of try and force those highlights to play around a little bit more. On some of your sharp edges, you've got that nice sort of silver edge highlight where you want that light to play off a little bit more. And just bring that into the sort of more rounded sort of volumes as well. You don't need to exclusively save that just for the edge highlights. On something like this, where it looks like you've gone for a really shiny metal approach, you can pull that in wherever you want it really. I think that the sort of glowing sort of eyes and things helps to really bring the focus in there to the face as well. On a model like this where you've got quite a lot of bright metal, it can be a bit hard to pull the focus in, but you've done that quite well. So that's quite nice. It's really the only area of cold color on the piece as well, which I think is a really nice sort of compositional choice. You've got very, very sort of warm metals and quite, you've got the reds and oranges on the base there, and then this really stark, really sort of cold, almost icy blue on the eyes. It really pulls the attention in and works really, really well on what could easily become quite a unfocused model just because of how busy it is with all that sort of detail there. I think that's really, really nice. In terms of sort of more specifically hitting in on the light placement, besides just saying, treat it like non-metallics. The first thing to think about in any case is in light placement is where is your light source. It looks a little bit like you've gone for just a general highlight everything kind of vaguely towards the top or where things stand out. So there doesn't seem to be like a really clearly defined and considered light source here. So just thinking of a light direction, is it that sort of over the head, sort of cloudy day, noon, dead zenithal highlight, or do you want, particularly with these sort of larger scale models, a slightly off to the side lighting idea can work really, really nicely. It creates a little bit of drama, and particularly if you like sort of have the light source on the camera left, just because at least in English speaking countries or sort of European sort of languages, we read left to right. So that scans really nicely for the eye, and it creates a little bit of drama in the piece and a little bit more interest. And then you can, but wherever you want to put your light, really, once you've decided that, you can literally just pick the model up, hold it at arm's length, close one eye, and sort of look at it from that direction, and that tells you where to highlight. To an extent, there's a little bit of bounce highlights and things exist, but that gives you a good rough idea of where to put things, especially once you've put your first layers of paint down, and if you've zenithal primed, it might be less easy to see that. But once you've got that, that sort of using mixing in matte paints into your metals to dull it down in the shadows and really sort of punching out those highlights to keep that nice sort of forcing the highlights to be where you want them to be, even with reflective paints. But overall, I think it's a really nice sort of successful piece. I think it works really well. It's really sort of the red fabric feels matter than the metals, even ignoring the fact that obviously they're painted to be shiny metallics. It feels like it's a fabric which that's covered in dust, which really fits with the basing and sort of the sort of scheme that you're going for. It looks really nice, and I really like the slight sort of greens you've got mixed into the golds as well. It just sells as a really nice sort of vibrant, lively sort of metal there for you.
Wow. I'd say you definitely covered all the lighting there, Alex. Wow. Jeez, man. I'll just chip in and say a little bit about the fabrics then. The front, I think, is working slightly better than the back. That's not to say that the back is bad. I just think that you've got a better level of contrast in the shadowed areas on the front. So I think if you were just to, because I think a lot of what's happening here, these shadows, is from the actual picture itself. You can see a very hard shadow here, which I think is just another reason it's a little bit tricky to. Alex did an amazing job, but to really analyze the lighting on it, because this is metal in a very stark light that you've taken the picture in. So a lot of these shadows are here are actually from the light you used to take the picture. So yeah, if you were just to increase the shadow, the painted shadows in the red cloth, I like the way it's been faded by being battered against the ground. That's a really nice touch. But yeah, if you were to bring it up to this sort of standard of shading, that'd be a good step forward as well. Yeah, so there's my bit, Alexis. Matt, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'd agree with like everything that Alex said. And also just add, when you're painting something in this large scale, you can think about where very important where your light's coming from, and you could also think about how your model would cast shadows on itself. So like he's a big muscular, well, I don't know, is it robot? Anyway, he's a large gentleman. And so he's gonna have a shadow like, of under his arms will be much more than on the side of his arms, for example. Uh, in behind his shield should be the darkest part probably in the whole thing. I probably would have painted the inside of the shield black, just so you or a very dark color, just so you don't get reflections appearing in there. Because like you think about it, how does light get in there? Um, and then if you add in shadows, it'll make your highlights look brighter. But it is all about taking control of that light, and doing a model all of this all in the metals is a big task. I think it looks really good. It's very interesting looking, kind of cyber warrior, and you've done a very good, like the kind of interesting metallic colors really lend to it, and as everyone said, the fabric looks fabulous as well.
Cool, nice one. Thanks, Alexis. So over to you, Matt. That was the
Cool.
last one.
Yeah, so that's us done for the month. If you are interested, if you happen to just be running into this video, if you're interested in joining the PmP, the Painters Motivating Painters, we're a Facebook group. Just Google it. And there are a number of questions you need to answer. And then you can submit your models into the monthly event. And also, there's plenty of people there who are always eager to help people out with any questions they have and help everyone with their progress, their painting to the next level. Um, We've really enjoyed reviewing your models as always. This month we're doing monsters. Already got a few pretty great entries there. Looking forward to seeing the rest of them in the future.